Before we begin, we would like to start with our land acknowledgement. And we would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we feel truly grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And so before I turn it over to our panelists, I would like to introduce today's moderator, Catherine Amanski. So Catherine is professor and director of the School of Leadership Studies at Royal Roads University, where she promotes engaged and action-oriented leadership. Catherine is also the co-editor of UTP's 2014 book, Learning and Teaching Community-Based Research. So welcome, Catherine, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for your kind introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen and Kusapsum speaking families in Victoria, and I just have such a deep honor and privilege to work and live and play on these beautiful lands that the Lekwungen and Kusapsum peoples have stewarded for time immemorial. It is my sincere pleasure to sort of host and moderate this discussion today with these incredible humans who I will introduce in just a moment. And I'd like to tell you, before I introduce them, I'd like to tell you why this book is exciting for me. So I've got, with my background, can you see it? I've got a copy of the book here too, Creating Spaces of Engagement. And as I was reading this book, it struck me, and you'll hear from the authors in a moment, but it struck me that the main argument that these authors are trying to convey to us, and that is so powerful, timely, and important for these exceptional times that we're living in right now, is that it's not just the theory, but it's also the practice of public engagement. We must figure out how to make these practices not only more inclusive. Inclusive is good. Inclusive means that we're aware that there are diverse voices out there, but not only inclusive. Ideally, that these processes of engagement and policy co-creation would be led by the very people who are affected by the policies that are intended to be of benefit or of service to them. And so for these authors, if I'm thinking holistically about the book, it's not just the product. Of course, the product of a new policy is important. It's also the process, the creative ways that we can engage with one another, the way that we can co-create together and really imagine our way into deeper democracy, deeper dialogue, and deeper engagement. And so this is a beautiful book. It's beautifully written. It's so engaging. There are so many different examples of creativity and frankly, cases that'll blow your mind of what's possible. And so it's really exciting for me to be here today. And especially, you know, often we shift our gaze to our neighbors to the south, and perhaps we have some American colleagues on the line today. But of course, at the beginning of this year, we witnessed this tragic attack on your democratic systems in the US. But let us not forget for 1 second that we are at risk here too in Canada, and that right now, emergency upon us, these ways of engaging with one another and creating opportunities for true democracy, for deeper equality, and for our collective human capacity for creativity to shine are just essential. So that is why I am excited to be here today. And enough from me. Let me introduce to you the brilliant minds behind this book. I'd like to introduce Leah Levac, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph, and a member of the Faculty Advisory Board at the university's Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. Thank you, Leah. Sarah Marie Wiebe is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, and adjunct faculty in the Department of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. So happy to have you back in Victoria, Sarah. And Rachel Magnuson is a senior project manager at the City of Vancouver, focusing on projects to support public life, public space, and active transportation. Rachel has a doctorate in political theory from York University in Toronto and has an interest in cities, sustainability, public space, democratic practice, and political theory. Thank you, Rachel. And Bruno de Oliveira Jaime is an award-winning art educator from Brazil. He's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba, where he teaches and researches in the areas of creative and critical pedagogies and arts-based research. And I have a feeling that might be one of his own creations behind you there, Bruno, the beautiful artwork behind you. Is that one of your own?
No, it's not. This is from a graffiti artist from Victoria.
Aha. Okay. Well, nice to have another connection to where I'm joining from today. All right, my friends, let's get into a little bit of a conversation about your book. Sarah, starting with you, can you tell us briefly about the case and core arguments that you discuss in...
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to all the other panelists for being here and many of the contributors who are also joining you all from Victoria. And in addition to co-authoring, I contributed to the volume is entitled Storytelling as Engagement, Learning from Youth Voices in Attawapiskat. So this chapter draws upon participatory arts-based research with youth in Attawapiskat and discusses a mixed media storytelling approach to public engagement. And this chapter is focused on effective and affective spaces of deliberation. So just briefly, the mixed media storytelling approach that I discussed, an interrogation of predominant portrayals of community dialogue with those directly affected by the portrayals to and what remains invisible. And the third dimension of this mixed media storytelling approach of an opportunity to intervene on those outside portrayals to speak back to asymmetrical narratives through situated voices, perspectives, and the stories of those who are experiencing duress in their everyday lives. So this chapter really tries to strike a balance between light and shadows, celebrating culture while critiquing colonialism. And to illuminate this, the chapter refers to digital stories that are co-produced with Attawapiskat youth as part of the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. And if you're interested, you can check out some of these vignettes and stories on our website with the same title, which is www.reimaginingattawapiskat.com. And then the chapter concludes with some lessons for deliberative democracy, scholars and practitioners who are interested in the arts of engagement, such as the importance of relationship building, investing in time, supporting multiple voices and forms of storytelling, committing to an iterative long-term process that might involve shifting timelines beyond sort of rigid academic timelines, and then kind of reminds us all of the importance of reflexivity and approaching communities as places of learning, so learning from and with community members. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Rachel, would you like to answer that same question, just telling us briefly about the case and core arguments that you discuss in your chapter?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my chapter is about the Grandview Woodland Citizens Assembly that took place in Vancouver back in 2014, 2015. And so it is a more typical, like standard-ish political engagement process, in the sense that citizens' assemblies have become very popular. They're well known in the kind of deliberative tradition, come out of that tradition. And at the time, I was working for a company called Mass LBP, which in Canada is kind of the foremost leader of these types of processes, and ran the Grandview Woodland Citizens Assembly in Vancouver for the city of Vancouver. And part of what I argue in this piece that is, I think, interesting is that it's at once it is that kind of a typical citizens assembly, so it has a lot of the same, it's very similar to other citizens assembly processes with some of those strengths and weaknesses that you see and that are debated in the literature. At the same time, part of what some of those debates miss, and part of what was maybe especially unique about this citizens assembly, is the kind of what I call like the radical democratic experience that I argue the participants themselves had, and trying to show what that actually looked and felt like, and how our framing and language around citizens assemblies, deliberative democracy, and even engagement doesn't capture the power of that experience. The fact that this was a very, very politicized citizens assembly. So it was coming into a context where the community was enraged, and this was a tool that the city used to try to get things back on track in their community planning. It's beyond that. It's also something that may be assemblies. So that's what sorts of details about the process themselves that I think are also interesting.
Would you like to give us a synopsis of your chapter?
Of course, I would love to. My chapter is about art. Not just art, but why art matters. Art matters in our lives. And I think through this pandemic, if there was anyone in doubt that art matters, I think that came to a closure. Imagine going through this pandemic without music, without film, without your favorite novel, your favorite books, your comic novels. Art matters, and it matters a lot. So my chapter is about art and how much art matters. So I start out the chapter asking the question, how can we create meaningful spaces of engagement for marginalized communities? Hold the art thought a little bit, I will get there. So again, how can we create meaningful spaces of engagement for marginalized communities? To do that, we need to understand, what do we mean by engagement? Because engagement has been used, so overused in the academia, that we're kind of like losing track of what it really means. So engagement, it is the ever-changing knowledge creation, knowledge co-creation, and mobilization that unfolds through relationships amongst people that have some common interests. These relationships, they do empower people, they do empower participants in that engagement process to take leading roles in their lives. Because knowledge is power. So once we know, we pursue that knowledge. So it empowers participants to take leading roles in their lives and help people to understand that they're not object of history. because they're constructing something. They're constructing something new. They're constructing and mobilizing new knowledge. So if they're not object of their own history, they are subjects of history. They're in charge of building their own historical process. In other words, we are not done as human beings. We are doing it. And art creates that space for engagement, creates that space, that dialogical and dialectical spaces for conversation. So that's what this chapter is about. What kind of conversation people engage when they are together painting, building a mural? One may argue that they might be thinking about color theories, and finger painting. It's not always the case. I'm gonna take 2 minutes to show you a conversation that happened when I was in Brazil doing this research project. So we are in a sewing studio that was set up by the city for people to learn how to sew, especially women. Because it was a community center led by female leaders. So there's a guy there taking the course as well. And during our conversation, he was saying something. He said that he quit the sewing workshop, and he was upset about it. He was like, yeah, I quit the sewing workshop because when women came here, all they did was just sit around and gossip. And then this other woman, she was like, yeah, we sat in a circle and that's what we do, and we chat. And he was like, well, but we have time to work and time to articulate our ideas. That's what this group is about. And then she was like, yeah, to have ideas. And then he says, yeah, instead of looking to people's lives, gossiping, we should look into our own lives. And this is where she nailed this conversation while making art. She said, well, this is how we think. I had one experience with the women he's talking about. We're a little bit separated in our circle because you're not just involved with the crafts making. We were involved with politics as well. And I love this quote because it was a very heated moment in Brazil history, just before the 2016 coup, with the fake impeachment of a female president. So, and this woman, they're really involved in the politics, and they're using my art. How dare them to use my art room to talk about politics? But that was the whole point. And I want to acknowledge, before I pass the ball into the next speaker, that I want to acknowledge that this book, with including conclusion and introduction, has 18 chapters. Out of these 18 chapters, 15 were written and led by females, a very powerful woman, and 3 by men. So politics is female, future is female, and I am so honored to be surrounded by my very powerful and intelligent colleagues here. And I thank you for allowing me into your gossip circle.
Thank you so much, Bruno. What a poignant example you shared of the sewing circle and the power of female-led politics. Thank you. Leah, would you like to answer this question as well? I know you've got a number of chapters between you and Sarah in the book, so please go ahead. What is the core argument that you're hoping to convey?
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thank you everyone else. just want to start also by acknowledging everybody who's participating today and all of the other extraordinary contributors who are a part of the call. I also want to recognize my place here on ancestral territory of the Attawandaron people and the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And comment that, you know, I recognize that land acknowledgements themselves have become sort of fraught political moments, but for me, they sort of symbolize an important recognition of the need to think more carefully about about where we are and what and how we are implicated in sort of the ongoing practices of colonization as settlers, which is how I identify. And so I'm grateful to be here. And it also segues me into the chapter. So I do have 2 chapters in the book. One of them I will not talk about, but I will just note that it's an interesting study of a public engagement initiative that was initiated by the province of New Brunswick to develop a poverty reduction strategy. It's a fairly simple empirical look at how women experienced that public engagement initiative, sort of based on the argument that often women are invisible in policy conversations. And so women, particularly living with low income, were active participants in many of the conversations. And so I just simply asked, you know, what was the experience of being a part of this conversation? And what were the features of the deliberation or the features of the dialogue that made it possible or comfortable to participate, or conversely that made it feel exclusive? So that's one of the chapters. The other chapter that I'll say a little bit more about today is a chapter that comes from an ongoing series of collaborations. So 2 community-based projects that I have been involved with over the last nearly decade now, one for longer than the other, in Happy Valley Goose Bay in Labrador and in Kitimat and the Haisla Nation in northwestern British Columbia. This chapter was co-authored with a doctoral student who works with me and who is on the call right now. Hi, and thank you, Jackie. And so this chapter asks the question, how do women in northern communities conceptualize their well-being? And then what questions related to resource extraction in a policy context are revealed if we're thinking and taking seriously the way that women understand their well-being in communities. So from a policy level, what we're looking at in this chapter is how do policy conversations get constructed, and what happens if particular actors in a community get constructed out of the conversation. So we use the social construction of policy framework to argue that Indigenous and Northern women have historically been constructed out of policy conversations. They have either been deemed dependent or deviant, sort of using the framework, and therefore not sort of relevant policy actors, especially in resource extraction contexts. And we try to sort of imagine, based on our ongoing work about women's well-being in the North, what kind of policy conversation we would be having if, in fact, the women with whom I have been collaborating were identified as active policy participants in that conversation. So, so in the broadest sense, then, what we're arguing is that resource-related policy conversations would be more sophisticated, and they would also engage with a more wide-ranging understanding of what constitutes an impact, a social, economic, political impacts of development in the North. We would have a wider ranging and more sophisticated understanding of what that meant if the experiences of women, as they articulate them through their well-being, were sort of constructed into these policy conversations. And we sort of carry on the argument to say that that the efficacy of deliberative democratic efforts hinges on this question of who gets to frame the problem that becomes constructed as part of the policy conversation. So I'll leave it there. But so that's chapter 4, and then the other chapter I mentioned is chapter 11 in the book. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Leah. What a powerful words at the end there. Who gets to frame the problem? So when we're talking about how inclusion isn't quite enough, you're talking about transcending this notion of inclusion and actually looking at who has the control over the process, really, and who gets to frame the problem, as you just said. Thank you. What powerful words from all of you. I'd just like to pause for a moment and let everyone in the audience know I'm looking at about 12:26, so it's our intention to wrap up by 1 p.m. The format for the rest of this session, what we're hoping to do is another 2 rounds, very brief rounds, on 2 more questions. We'll see if, how much we have time for here. And then toward the end, we'd like to offer an opportunity to answer just a couple questions. So there is a Q&A feature on Zoom. It'll depend on your device, what kind of device you're using, but for many of you, it might be along the bottom bar next to the chat room. So that's the Q&A session is where that's the tool we'd like to use toward the end. And for the time being, let's do just a little bit more, get a few more nuggets of wisdom from our panelists here. Recognizing, of course, I know that there are a number of you who are contributors to this book who are in the audience today. And so, really appreciating all of the authors and all of the contributors. And in this particular moment, let's continue focusing on these 4 authors. So perhaps I'll come back to you, Rachel. How about answering this question? How do you envision participatory methods pushing the boundaries of the constraints of our contemporary colonial liberal state? So how to push the boundaries of our colonial liberal state through these participatory methods we're all talking about. Over to you.
Sure. So I would say that's a really interesting question, especially for this case study. And actually a lot of the work that I do, I work for a government, a city. And so for this particular case study, you have an example where, of course, it's a city-led process. They are defining, you are contributing in this way to the community plan. Your recommendations will be taken seriously. Ultimately, the decision lies with council, et cetera, et cetera. Like a very traditional model of, in that sense, of fitting within the liberal state. And I think there's a lot of very powerful critiques of citizens' assemblies or deliberative democracy generally about the limitations of that as an approach, and that we often need so much more in terms of both engagement but also politics straight up, rather than these very controlled processes. At the same time, although I think that those critiques are very important, again, sort of picking up on what Leah was saying, there's something that could be, that's lost if we simplify it just down to those critiques. Any moment where you're bringing people together to act as equals and to inviting them in to make policy decisions is incredibly radical. And especially, I think the model of a citizens' assembly really pushes that boundary in a way that we can easily kind of not appreciate from the outside. And so what is so interesting about seeing that experience for people is just how radical it is. And I think it goes for people of all walks of life. So most of us, well, all of us, we all operate in a world day to day that's incredibly hierarchical, incredibly stratified, all these power dynamics at play. Of course, those are still dynamics within a citizens' assembly, but it's more than that. You're forcing this situation of equality among participants, where you have to sit at a table, where you're asked to work together, where you're asked to really struggle with epically complicated issues, and it's your job to wrestle with them, and you wrestle with them together. If you think to your own experience in the world, how few of us have ever had any experience like that? Probably like very, very few moments in reality where we've been forced to act as equals with others in that kind of demanding environment. And so what I try and unpack in this piece is to not discount that experience for people and just how radical it is. And why I said from different walks of life, it's not simply for those who are normally excluded from policymaking. Of course, for them, you know, there are people on the Citizens Assembly, for example. I'm thinking of one Indigenous elder. She had never, ever been invited into a space like this before. And it was like an incredibly life-transforming experience for her. But it's not only for her, it's also for the privileged person like me who's sitting next to, who may be, let's say, some engineer who's sitting next to at a table with diverse people and having to realize that they're maybe not as smart as they think they are, that they don't all have the answers either, that they have to take seriously this person next to them, and then they're forced back into this situation where their privilege and what they normally walk around with every day is taken away. And so to me, that is a really powerful thing that we have too few opportunities for in our dynamic and our society, sorry. And so I think I'm curious about, and there is examples of this throughout the book of like other ways we can create those moments for people and institutionalize them in various forums so that it's not such a rare experience.
Wow, Rachel, what incredible words. Any opportunity for engagement as equals is radical. That's quite an idea to take forward. Thank you so much. Bruno, what are your thoughts on this question about pushing the boundaries of our contemporary colonial liberal state?
I absolutely love this question, and I was reflecting on this question as Rachel was answering, and I went back to this morning when I was talking to my wonderful students about multiple intelligences. I will get to the methodology, but it's the same example. In class, we teach our teacher candidates to multi-intelligences, holistic approaches, and the individual is not just mental, is emotional, is past history, present, future, physical, and everything. And yet, when it comes to assessment, the class this morning was about assessment. When it comes to assessment, we put it in a box and we assess mental. We threw everything that we know out of the window. The same comes to these participatory methods. Okay, so first of all, the lenses. The lenses, when we look at our work through indigenous methodologies lenses and feminist lenses, those methodologies inherit, I don't know how to say this word, I'm ESL, by nature. So those lenses by nature, they are inclusive. So that's the lenses. But we do have to really use these lenses to come up with other ways of validation of the work that we do. Because we can use indigenous methodologies related to participatory methods, when at the end we are validated by white Eurocentric standards. First thing to do, in my opinion and my experience working in the field, indigenous lenses, feminist lenses, and we do need to come up of I'm gonna say appropriate ways of validating the work, or do we have to validate it, the work? Do we have to validate research, this kind of research? Does it even called research? Is it still appropriate? Should we call inquiry? Do we have hypotheses? Or should we call claims, assumptions? I don't know. So those are my 2 points. It comes to the lenses and to the validation of the work.
Thank you, Bruno. I'm just loving hearing this from the perspective of the city, of education, of different kinds of contexts that everyone is working in. So those of you in the audience who don't have a copy of the book really get a sense of how these ideas are being applied in such a diverse range of contexts. Thank you so much, Bruno. Leah, would you like to answer this question as well?
Sure, maybe I'll just add a couple of quick points. So for me, one of the most important features of the book that is partly a response, really, albeit perhaps unwritten response to this question of pushing the boundaries of the state, is that there are a number of cases in the book that take up participatory and community engaged forms of scholarship as a way of thinking through spaces of engagement, right? As a way of creating opportunities to have an impact on or lead or be part of transformative policy conversations. And so very simply then, one of the ways that participatory methods, I think, push the boundaries is by forcing this recognition that the public is heterogeneous, right? That there are many publics, and that oftentimes these publics are invisible, and they're made invisible because of the way that the process unfolds. So they're made invisible through the conversations, and accordingly, then the public gets imagined as a more and more homogeneous group, and it's just simply not the case. So that's sort of one of the pieces that I think is it is a way that participatory methods push back. They make room for more and different people. The second thing that I would say, and this is maybe a controversial or a controversial claim or one of the tensions in the book, is that they offer I think that participatory methods can actually create spaces outside of the state that force the state to react, to respond. And when that's happening, we hitch the more rigid structures of policymaking and the liberal state to a much more sort of open and fluid way of thinking about public participation. And in some ways we call or invite this sort of transformative linking, the link between the state and a more engaged space of listening and learning. And the reason that this is a bit controversial is because, I think just earlier today there was a panel in our department, and the question, one of the questions that got posed was, are we can we transform the existing state, right? Or do we need to start over? And I would say that we are making a tentative argument here that, and maybe borrowing from the words of Patricia Hill Collins, to say surviving within yet challenging the intersecting oppressions of the state, right? Or so when we were writing about it in the book, we say we're trying to transform while resist state power, and interact with the colonial state while rejecting colonialism. So these are tense moments, and and I think they're fair questions about the extent to which that's possible. But I do think that these alternative spaces that we're trying to convey through all of the chapters in the book are one way of examining the way that we stretch some of those boundaries and explore the possibility of some of this transformative practice.
Aha, thank you. Thank you, Leah. Colleagues, I have a question coming in the Q&A chat box at this point. So I know that we have one more round of questions, but in an effort to, as awkwardly as it happens in Zoom, but to model what it is that we're talking about really, I think it would be important to open up the dialogue to the person who has taken the bold risk of asking that question. So I'd like to suggest we move to that question, and then we can close the panel with that final question for reflection. Does that work for all of you? Yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up and some nods. Okay, so we've got Keith Hamilton here who's asked a question. Can you offer any advice on how to approach engagement when the need for the creation of policy is politically divisive? So when the policy or the need for creating that policy is politically divisive, how would we approach engagement? What are some of the strategies that you might call upon here? And the examples offered are creating policies on directing long-term population growth as an example. Is that clear to all of you? Can you see that coming up? Yeah. Okay, so who would like to jump in with this one? Go ahead, Rachel. Yeah.
So I guess I do think citizens' assemblies are an interesting tool for these divisive policy issues. And part of it, and this is not something I talk about in the chapter, but in their ideal form, they create time. And they create time and depth for conversation and learning. And that is pretty radical too in our world right now. And so just the fact that you can create a space where people revisit topics, they hear from different perspectives, and they have time to digest and think about them together is like a huge advantage when you're struggling with complex policy issues, and especially if they're politically divisive. Obviously, there's lots of tools that are used all the time around kind of naming common values, that type of thing, to kind of bring people together. They can be really useful. Personally, I struggle with them as well because they can shut down debate. So it's always a bit of a balancing act, but I think, yes, I think time is really key.
Fabulous. Thank you, Rachel. Any other thoughts on this question? We do have one more coming up in the chat as well. So if you would like to chime in on this question, go for it. And if not, we can move to the next question. This notion of time, relationship, has come up in a few of the comments that you've made. And, this is in this world where it seems like time is a scarce resource, creating a process, designing processes from the beginning, knowing that you want to create more space and time is difficult and needs to be done intentionally. So I really appreciate you mentioning that, Rachel, and others who have said that as well. Okay, next question here, and we've got two more popping up, so we've got 3 questions. Next question here is from Christy. My question is both practical and theoretical. What does it mean to find the common good or common ground in deliberative democracy forums, and what challenges does our post-truth era pose to finding common good with citizens? What does it mean to find the common good or common ground in deliberative democracy forums? And what challenges does our post-truth era pose to finding common good with citizens? Any brave takers of that one?
I have only unsatisfactory things to say in response to this question, but to thank you for the question, Christy, because I think this is probably one of the next places that some of this thinking I think needs to go is, you know, how do we deal with the assault on democracy that we're sort of watching unfold through, you know, autocratic populist movements around the world. You know, in terms of what constitutes the common good, substantively, we try to make an argument in the book about striving for something called policy justice. And so we frame this as sort of a both equitable and inclusive way of thinking about anti-oppressive practices. And so my answer about the common good would, you know, sort of somehow flows from that commitment. In terms of dealing with the sort of post-truth era and what does common good look like, I have tried this is not a very necessarily practical or theoretical answer, but I will say that it still seems to me that at the end of the day, many people across many truths are motivated at the core by the same kinds of basic things, right? Their well-being, the well-being of their families, the right to feel like they're being treated fairly. Now, the extent to which the ways people understand that are dramatically different. And of course, the substantive empirical realities of how that plays out are dramatically different. So I'm not trying to erase any of those power discrepancies, but I will refer briefly to my chapter on the experiences of women living with low income. In that provincial public engagement initiative, there was actually a tremendous amount of common ground, even amongst business executives and people who were not able to make ends meet, because at the end of the day, they all brought similar concerns about taking care of themselves and their families. And so I think this has something to do with how we try to find a starting place that imagines sort of a way that everybody gets these opportunities for not just survival, but for thriving and for belonging and meaning.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. And one of my tasks is to be mindful of the time. And so we do have 3 more questions. I'd like to see if we can get to them. I'd also like to encourage everyone, you know, sometimes because we're in this Zoom platform, the setup encourages us to look to the experts here, our panelists, of course, and they are experts because they've written a book about it and they've given it certainly a lot of thought. I'd like to suggest as well that there's a lot of expertise in the audience, and so again, as a way of endeavoring to reflect the very values that our panelists are offering us, if others have more to contribute in response to these questions, please, by all means, feel free to put your ideas in the chat as another way. Of course, we want to be actively listening to our panelists, but as another way of engaging and expressing, you can also use the chat for that purpose. So the next question I'd like to perhaps ask Bruno to start is from Andrea, or perhaps Andrea. Forgive me if I don't know the right pronunciation. I'm interested in hearing more of your suggestions about integrating some of the insights from the book into pedagogy and the classroom. Bruno, do you have some thoughts on that? I'm sure everyone might, but Bruno, to start.
Yeah, I can start on this one. As a matter of fact, I was talking about this morning in my class. So it's just like a continuation of that. Okay, so one way of approaching and thinking of your classroom is through Paulo Freire's perspective, pedagogy of the oppressed. What does that mean? Paulo Freire talks about dialectic methodology and dialogical processes. Dialectical methodology, so imagine you and your class, everybody sit in a circle, always. Starting point, always sit in a circle. that deconstruct power relations a lot in your class. So class sit in a circle. How does dialectic methodology looks like? We start from people sharing, and there's a lot of relationship built up before this. But when you get to that point that everybody's confident, safe, create the safe space, start your students and yourself start sharing your personal stories, things that you're afraid of. You can ask your student, what are you afraid of? What motivates you? Who should we stand up for? What do we do next? So we start reflect on that personal experience, individual personal experience, and collectively in the circle, we reflect upon those experiences. We think about the practices that what are the practices that we're doing in real life? How are you standing up for people? And then we reflect upon those practices. It's kind of like a spiral thingy. That's the theory behind of it. Another way is one of the problems that we have in the classroom with teachers and students, there's a name. The name, it's a word, it's fear. We are fearful of let it go. Just frozen, Elsa, let it go, let it go. Let it go your power. Give your students the power to design their rubrics for the assignment. Include your students into the conversation. That is democracy inside your classroom. Include your student in this, in creating the rubrics, in creating the assignments and the exams as well. I'm just gonna grab something here to show you. So today in class, I work with this book, and I can't put the title here on the chat. I'm advertising another book. Chapter 5 talks exactly about democracy in the classroom. Let your student have power as well. That's democracy.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and to all the other panelists. Perhaps I'll just ask you to reflect if there are further ideas you'd like to share. Could you please do those in your closing remarks in response to our last round of questions? So I'll take, there's one more question about citizen assemblies, which, Rachel, I'm going to ask you to answer that one in your closing remarks, if you could. The question is about, could citizen assemblies become a form of governance itself? So if you could just think in advance about how to integrate that into your final closing comments. And then Sarah, could I ask you to take this one? To what extent is thinking through participatory engagement and deliberative democracy primarily something of concern to how we understand democracy in the global north? And how might it be different elsewhere in the world or in so-called non-democratic areas? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Thanks, Catherine. Well, I think Bruno provides such a great example of kind of the rich history of knowledge democracy and kind of radical critical pedagogy and thought that comes from a non-kind of northern perspective. And so I think kind of being mindful that there are multiple intelligences, multiple literacies, multiple ways of thinking about democracy, and then trying to also sort of de-Westernize or kind of unsettle the ways that we think about democracy from this kind of traditional hierarchical, reasoned, rational approach. So yeah, I would just say, while I'm not an expert on deliberative democracy from the global south, I think there is a really rich tradition of thought that is helpful when we're thinking about those very questions of what to bring into the classroom, how to kind of make these learning spaces less hierarchical, more dynamic, more engaged. And I'm hopeful about the examples like Rachel's raised, for instance, in her chapter and her comments about citizens' assemblies and trying to find these spaces that are these radical spaces of equality, which don't happen all that often. And I think the way that Bruno is describing the classroom is kind of similar to that. So I would say that I'll get to this in my closing remarks, but when we talk about policy justice, something that we're talking about is being aware of how many spaces of public engagement are quite power laden, and they're not these neutral spaces. So I think that's kind of a starting point for this conversation, acknowledging that, and then trying to kind of work with different diverse knowledge carriers to kind of unsettle these democratic spaces and think differently about democracy itself. So it's actually a very profound theoretical question that the poser of this question is asking. So thank you for that thoughtful provocation. And I hope that you'll find some nuggets of sort of assistance with responding to that question in the collection of chapters themselves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to everyone who posed the questions, who listened to the responses, and who contributed in different ways in the chat or otherwise through ongoing conversations after our time is up. So my friends, we have about 4 minutes left. I have a challenge for you. In 1 minute, Leah and Sarah, as editors of the book, are kind of going back and forth. So in one minute, may I ask you, Bruno, then Rachel, then Sarah, to make your concluding remarks in response to the question, how do ideas about deliberative democracy in this book advance the conversation about public policy and policy justice?
I'm gonna do in 30 seconds is start the clock. Deliberative democracy challenges neoliberal discourses. I love when in Sarah's chapter, when she explains the difference between public consultation and deliberative democracy, because one follows into neoliberal discourses, government, checking out the box. Yeah, we talk to citizens. Deliberative democracy, no, it's different. It is the Paulo Freirean dialectical and dialogical spaces. So it does provide, it challenges neoliberal discourses. That's it.
Thank you, Bruno. Rachel, over to you.
I would say that I think part of what various case studies show in this book is that you can have both a foot in the system and a foot out of the system at the same time. And it's that more complex space that we should pay attention to, because there can be, it can both affect policy outcomes, but also provide a democratic experience for participants where we might not otherwise see it. So to just not fall too quickly into dismissing various kinds of actions and look at them more closely, or practices rather.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. Excellent reminder. And Sarah, over to you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief here, and thanks for this sort of last chance for closing remarks. And I again want to highlight some of the rich contributions that come out in the other chapters. And one of the main arguments that we advance in this book is that policy justice requires an interdisciplinary approach. And so there are many contributors here in the audience, so thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing. One of the concepts that actually stuck with me quite a bit was from a chapter co-authored by Alana Katapan, Alexandra Dabrowski, Tammy Finley, and April Madrona. And this chapter is titled Power, Privilege, and Policy Making, Reflections on Changing Public Engagement from the Ground Up. And they talk about feminist policy and radical policy futures. So just in closing, I want to kind of invite you to ride this wave of enthusiasm to read these chapters, to think, you know, what does radical policy look like? What does that mean to you? And then think about the multiple phases of policy making, you know, framing of issues, development of policies, and the implementation, and trying to kind of bring that radical reflective lens throughout each of these kind of phases, as we're thinking both about kind of the theory, the practice, and the research methods. So I acknowledge that, you know, we're running against the clock here. So I want to thank everybody for your time, for contributing, and for being part of this rich conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And let me echo your encouragement to ride this wave of enthusiasm. I love how you said that. And if you haven't picked up a copy of your book yet, please do so. This kind of message, the message that's embedded in this book, is essential to the transformation of our consciousness that is needed in these times. For us to survive as a species, as a human species around the globe, in the face of such existential crises as the climate emergency and others, all of the exacerbated inequalities that we've seen forever, but that have been amplified through the pandemic. This book provides concrete examples of the strategies and the consciousness, the ways of working that will allow us to move forward in these times. And so I'd like to thank all of the panelists today. I'd like to thank all of the contributors who are in the audience. I'd like to thank the University of Toronto Press for having the vision and the foresight to publish a book like this. And in closing, back over to you, Brianna. Thank you very much, my friends.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Sarah, Leah, Bruno, and Rachel. This was a wonderful and interesting discussion. And thank you to everyone who wrote in with their questions. It was excellent. And yes, and just as a reminder, if you are interested in ordering a copy of the book from our website, you can do so using the link in the chat, as well as the discount code. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day. Thank you very much.